Hey everyone, it's Hudson here. I'm at my standing desk here at the studio, excited to share a technique that I use quite a bit called focus blending. If you're in a scene, find a beautiful scene, it's not an ultra wide angle shot to get you that depth of field that an ultra wide lens gets you. Maybe it's really low light in the blue hour and you want to get the foreground all the way to the background in focus without ramping the ISO up to the point where you're going to have a ton of noise because you're using such a narrow aperture. This is a technique that can let you photograph that scene at f8 at a lower ISO and really get the detail all the way from the foreground to the background in. We're going to use Lightroom to do the raw processing of these images, and then I'm going to show you how I'll blend them in On1 Layers 10. It would also work almost identically in Photoshop. I go back and forth between which I use for this stuff, and then I'll do some finish edits in On1's Effects 10, which is really the app that I like to kind of do finishing edits. So the image that we're going to talk about is one that I captured on my drive into Torres del Paine National Park this last fall, spring down in Patagonia. It's down in southern Chilean Patagonia, one of the most beautiful national parks I've ever been to in my life. And on my way in, I drove into this really wonderful sunset. As I'm driving in with my wife, the sun is setting. I wanted to capture an image that had that last little bit of the sun just rimming down, get kind of a sun star. So I stopped alongside this lake and really spent a lot of the good light capturing this HDR image that I'll talk about a little bit right here. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this HDR image that I created on my way into the park and into camp, except to say that, as the sun was rimming down, I couldn't help but stop by this lake, and I found this nice little spot on kind of a steep embankment with some color to catch that last second as the sun was rimming down behind the hill. And that's what really kept me from finding the location that I really liked best of that night, and therefore being in really low light and needing to use some exposure blending techniques. For this image, I captured it. There's so much dynamic range that even with the Nikon D810's amazing sensor, I chose to capture it in 3 frames, 2 stops underexposed, right on the D810's meter, and 2 stops overexposed, and then blend it in Lightroom CC's really cool new merged HDR, which just creates a raw file with a ton more dynamic range and tonal adjustability. I really like the natural way that lets me just add dynamic range to the image without getting that kind of HDR look that we all think of as HDR. So that's why I was late finding the image that I found. So having captured the image of the sun rimming down behind the mountains, it was time to drive in and get to camp. And, the sunlight was pretty much gone. I figured photography was done for the day, so I just threw everything in the back. I was more thinking about where food for dinner was going to be as we pull out the cook stoves, driving down these kind of rough gravel roads that flow through the park. And it was kind of while driving along into the last afterglow of the sunset that I started noticing that there were some kind of sheltered little bodies of water that were reflecting the mountains really beautiful with these just gorgeous granite boulders and rock formations in them. So I pulled the truck to the side and hopped out. And the only camera I really had accessible to me was my Nikon D750, which works great in low light with the 24 to 120 kind of general purpose lens that I kind of carry around as my catch-all. I just have it sitting next to me in the driver's seat in case I see some beautiful wildlife or something. And so I grabbed a tripod off the pile of stuff in the back, that camera and lens, and hopped out to just sort of see what I saw. And what I saw was sort of astounding. I'll show you. So as I stopped beside this really beautiful small lake, I crawled down the embankment with the camera and the tripod, and then I noticed that the mountains that were reflecting in this lake were just so interestingly shaped. It's that last kind of afterglow from half an hour after sunset. It's turning into blue hour. And there was this beautiful, interesting rock that was sticking out of the shallows alongside the road, this nice piece of granite. And I got a little bit excited. I framed up this handheld shot and spun my ISO up to 4,000th of a second to get something handheld. Because I think I'm at somewhere around 32 millimeters. Yeah, 32 millimeters. And, that's going to be a really grainy shot at 4,000. But I just wanted to see what it looked like on the camera back. And when I saw, I was, let's grab the tripod. So I set up on the tripod, slowed my shutter down to 3 seconds to get down to 1600 ISO at about f8. And took a quick shot, and I realized, obviously it's going to be a little bit grainy, but 1600 I know I can clean up with my D750. It has a great sensor. But even at f8, focusing about a third of the way into the scene here with this rock, there's a few rocks in the foreground. It's maybe somewhere near a third of the way into the scene. There's no way I'm going to get infinity in focus at f8. And if I stop down further, I'm going to have to ramp up the ISO, or go with a really long exposure shutter speed. And when you start getting into 10 seconds and beyond, you start introducing more noise from the long exposure. So I decided that instead, given that it's kind of a nice, smooth, uniform surface in here, what I'd do instead is capture a couple of frames, focus differently. So, jump into the live view in the back of my camera, get really composed nicely. And the first image I captured here, the same exposure, keeping the exposure exactly the same. You don't want it to vary, just like a panoramic merger that way. These files have to blend nicely. So staying at 3 seconds at f8 at 1600, I captured an image that I made sure doesn't matter whether it's focused on the rock, but it matters that it's focused in the background peak. So I got that infinity focus, and that led to a nicely focused reflection in the lake itself. And then I captured another image focused on the rock. I'm hand focusing in my live view. I'm zooming in and making sure that rock looks sharply focused to me on the screen as I scroll around the screen, using the back view of my camera. If you're a Sony user, you can turn on the focus assist and it'll zoom automatically as you're manually focusing. And you can see it 100% whether you've got something in focus or not. And you can see the noise is very manageable here at 1600. I know that I'm going to have a raw file that I can process easily. So for me, in the workflow that I have, the next step is to jump into Lightroom and raw process these two images in the develop module before blending them in On1 Layers. So let's hop over to Lightroom. So I'm here in Lightroom and I'm taking a look at sort of the basic adjustments that I do to our two images here, the one that's focused on the background and the one that's focused on the foreground. And I neglected to mention that when you're out in the field capturing these images for exposure blending, just like if you're photographing a panoramic or another image intended to be blended, it's really important that you go into manual mode on your camera and you keep all the settings uniform. If you're photographing in RAW, white balance isn't as important, but you need the aperture shutter speed and ISO to all be locked in place because you want both of these images to really look identical. And I've run in here and I've just done some basic treatments. I left my white balance as is. I think the camera did a great job with blue hour here. I obviously pushed up the exposure a little bit, added some contrast, pulled back the highlights, pushed up the shadows, pushed up the whites a little bit, just added tonal range. And then I go ahead, I make sure both images are selected and the one that I've adjusted is selected. I hit the sync button and you can go ahead here, check none, and then just check that all the pieces that matter to you here are going to be adjusted exactly the same way between the two images. You go ahead and click synchronize, and now all those basic adjustments that you've done to one image are also done to the other. Now this is a low light image photographed at 1600, so one of the things that I want to do here in Lightroom is run in and do some detail work, both sharpening and noise reduction. And I've already done that here, but I'm going to show kind of my methodology a little bit. This is the image obviously that's focused on the background mountains and hills, and you can see that if I turn off the detail work I've done, it gets pretty grainy and much less focused. It probably looks fine on a computer monitor in small resolution, but if you're making a big fine art print from this thing, you're going to want to clean that up. And you can see I've sort of sharpened the image a little bit. I've done some noise reduction. I find that holding the Option key down and as I'm moving these sliders around, viewing the image in black and white really helps to make these decisions, both with sharpening and with noise reduction. In a low light image like this, I'm going to start with noise reduction and get to where it looks kind of clean, do a little bit of sharpening to get to where it looks nice and sharp to me, and then the masking the masking slider is really, really critical in this process from my perspective. And when you hold down the Option key, you'll see really how nice that works. I can see right now there's still noise in the sky that I'm sharpening. As I add more masking to the image, you can see I'm just starting to kind of pull that masking out of the sky. And now we've got an image where we're not sharpening any noise that's left over. Now let's say I hadn't done as much noise reduction. Let's see what that masking slider might look like with less noise reduction applied. Even if I slide it up, these two things are in sync with one another. So you want to generally, to my mind, I go in, I do my noise reduction, holding down the Option key again or Alt on the PC to sort of see a black and white vision of the image. Kind of helps with noise reduction. get the noise pretty clean to a level I'm happy with, then go back in and adjust the sharpening, because noise is kind of that noise reduction is getting rid of the noise by blurring edges in the images a little bit. So you're gonna have to come back in and add some sharpening to get that look back that you want. You can play around with the radius and detail a little bit. Generally in these low light images, especially in landscapes, I leave it pretty low, and then you go in and do your masking. So, in a lot of cases, you're gonna wanna do exactly the same. In this case, I looked at the background mountains in one image. I went in and did exactly the same thing in the other image with the foreground, and I found that they looked pretty darn similar. I was able to get a nice sharp image with the same settings, but I wouldn't have been opposed to sharpening the foreground a different way. It's not really going to show up. As you can see here, it looks really nice and clean. And so we're ready. We've got these images done. We're ready to create PSD files and jump into On1 Layers and blend these two images to get one image with all the depth that I want. So On1 Layers is going to open this all as a single PSD file with all the edits that we put in Lightroom's raw processing and develop into two separate layers. So we've got the image with the close foreground focus and the image with the infinity focus stacked on top of each other here. And I'm going to zoom into 50% so that I can just make sure which layer is which, how it's stacked it in here. And I can see that our foreground layer is underlying our background layer. This is the image where the background is all sharp and in focus, and underneath it is our one that has the rock and the foreground in focus. So simply to blend these two in On1 Layers, all I'm going to need to do is go in and mask that background layer off of the foreground. And like I said, when I was looking at this scene, there's this nice smooth area that makes it really easy to do that. So I'm going to go ahead, grab my masking brush, and I'm going to leave the opacity at 100% for the foreground here. And I'm going to go ahead and check for my Wacom tablet. I really love using a Wacom tablet to mask and to paint effects in and out of images. I'm going to let the pressure of my Wacom tablet adjust size and just leave the brush kind of big. And then all I need to do is really use my masking brush and just kind of paint the background layer, that top layer, off of my foreground layer by just masking it out with the masking brush. And as I work, you can see it's developing a mask here. And I have my opacity set kind of low here. I'm going to set it up to 100% to make sure I get the elements in the foreground masked out that I want. And you can see there was enough of a change in the light in between these two images that there's a little bit of a line appearing on the water around the rock. And this looks like kind of poor editing. Well, what do we do about that? Well, it's really easy. We can increase our feather a little bit of our brush, turn our opacity down, say to like, I don't know, 40%, something like that. And just kind of in broad brushstrokes, kind of paint along that edge until we get rid of any identifiable editing line. We're just sort of smoothly, softly masking that in. And there you go. Boom. We have a blended set of exposures, one focused close, one focused distant. Easy peasy, done. The last thing I do here in Layers is hit save. It's just that simple. Oh, actually, as I look here, I can see on my mask, and that's another trick. You can turn this on right here. See that I missed this one spot. I'm going to turn my opacity, back up to 100%. See all these little tricks that On1 throws in here. Keep a sloppy editor like me from making a mistake like that. And I'll go ahead and turn the mask view back off. Oh, and you know what? I noticed I've got this little branch here. This gives me a chance to showcase one of my favorite tools. I missed this when I was out photographing. One of my favorite tools in On1 Layers is the Perfect Eraser. And I'm going to go ahead, kind of zoom in a little bit here, maybe 50% on this big D810 image. And we're going to scroll down in the foreground. And I'm going to show you just how well this tool works. It's kind of crazy. You can go through here and just paint objects out of the scene, and it's a content, oh, I'm on the wrong layer. That layer is already masked out. It's the layer underneath. This is a content aware fill brush. Essentially, it's kind of a healing brush, and it just keeps the underlying texture and eliminates the distraction that it somehow has this great algorithm. And On1 really nailed it with this one. I was just so excited and blown away when I saw how well this was working in Photo 10. Well, okay, occasionally you have to go through and do it a couple hits, but generally it just captures that underlying texture and leaves it behind and gets rid of your distraction. That simple, a few clicks. So now with that distraction removed, we really have what I was going for. So now that I've got these two images blended, these two layers blended in a way that I like, I'm going to go ahead and select both of them, and I'm going to go ahead and hit the copy layers button, and that's going to create two new layers, two identical copies of this one we were just working on. And then I want to go ahead and hit the merge button. That's going to merge those two with them both highlighted into a single layer with all of our edits. So you can see if I turn that on and off, that layer has everything we've just done. It blends those two. But by copying them and merging them into a new layer, it still leaves all the underlying work that I did. I can go back and readjust it. It's just a way to kind of save all the work that I've done in case I want to go back and redo any of it. So I'm going to click on this new layer that we've got, and I want to take that into On1 Effects to do my final finishing edits. And boom, there I am in Effects. On1 Effects is my favorite place to go into and do the finish edits on basically all of my portfolio images. It's just a really fast, easy way to get the look that I want. And I generally start with landscape images, particularly ones where everything's in focus with dynamic contrast. It just adds this nice mid-tone contrast pop, a little bit of sharpening, a little bit of clarity, and it gives my images this nice crisp look that I love. And I always want to go in, especially in a low light image like this, and look at it a little bit closer and make sure that there isn't some noise that I missed. That sometimes dynamic contrast, you can be adding contrast in noisy sections of the image. You just want to make sure that it's looking good. It's going to take this a minute to load because we are talking about a big D8 file with lots of new edits. So we're taking just a second here. I'll say I generally start with a natural dynamic contrast setting and maybe add a little bit of small contrast detail. And you can see here, if I click on and off, it's done a whole lot of work for this image. I just really like the change and the drama that it adds. So I'm happy with that. Doesn't look like there's any noise that we really are enhancing. I think we did a good job in Lightroom getting rid of that before we ever brought these images in here into layers and started blending them. So, looking at this image, the last thing I think I might want is a little bit of color enhancing, in particular a sky enhancer, because I see a lot of blue and white in this image, and I think this really overdoes the foreground, obviously, but it's doing something up here in the sky that I really like. I'm not very happy about it turning this section of snow a little bit blue, adding a little bit of blue in that tone. So I'm going to go ahead, same way we did in layers, I'm going to grab the masking brush, and I'm just going to paint maybe about a 50% opacity brush. I just want to paint that effect out of the portions of the image that I don't want it. So I want it up in that upper sky, but I don't necessarily want it here in the snow on the mountains, and I know I don't want it in the blue of the lake. The blue of the lake got a little bit deeper, darker blue reflection than the sky, because the sky was just a brighter exposure. So I'm just going to go ahead and make some multiple passes across the blue in the water here. I don't really want that kind of unnatural blue. I just want to get that the way I remember it being in the sky. Take it out of the snow and the reflection too, and voila, there we are. Whenever you want to do work with the mask in effects, you can always click this little icon right here, the mask icon. And you can copy a mask to apply it to another effects layer. You can paste, you can invert it, which would completely flip the effect. We'd have kind of the opposite thing that we were looking for. I'll just invert it back. Really fun, easy to work with. And now that I'm looking at it, I see, there are some greens in here, and I'm curious what adding one more color enhancing layer, there's no rule against multiple filter layers of the same filter, but I'm going to go ahead and try a green enhancer filter. We've done sky. I'm going to add a little green. It's subtle, but I see a little bit of a shift, especially in here. I see a little bit more standing out of the green in the hillsides in the foothills leading up to the mountains. And voila, I'm really, really happy with this image. We've got this focus blended, final edited image here that I'm really happy with. It's what I envisioned when I was out there capturing the scene. And some people might ask me, wouldn't it make sense to just wait till the next morning and come back and photograph this in an easier light condition? But I think any of us who are out photographing the landscape, this was in very low light, but I had the look that I want, that blue hour look, that soft afterglow on the mountains, and particularly in a place like Patagonia where the winds just rage. I mean, this was my first night in the park, and this night and the next morning were the only times I saw the water still in 2 weeks that I was traveling through these mountains. There's just generally raging winds. You've got lots of weather. In any place you're photographing, don't take for granted that the ideal conditions you have at the moment are going to repeat themselves later on. If you've got a nice situation to photograph, go ahead and do the best work with it that you can at the moment. I'm really happy that I stopped and got this image when I did, because it really was my only shot at it. So I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial. It's a great way for me to share some of the skills and tools that I've learned over the years. I hope it helps you be a little more creative in your photography, or find some solutions to problems that you often encounter, or even just think about a scene in a little bit of a different way. If you enjoyed it and you're not following along on my social, I'd encourage you to jump over to my Instagram account, my Facebook account, my Twitter account, whichever your social media favorite is. I'll post whenever I'm doing these things. I've got a YouTube channel. Everything's easily accessed through www.hudsonhenry.com. And I'm also at the On1 Plus coaching site.